So I'm going to play a clip. Now, I am fully aware that we have been given authority by Jesus in the way that I have previously discussed, and I believe it's show 5. What I was not aware of is the so-called extent of that authority that supposedly is that of the throne of God himself. I think that's just ridiculous. As I have already said, the authority of the believer was given in the context of the church, and the realm of that authority is that of the earth and not the heavens. So here is the clip.
One of the main problems with modern spiritual warfare movement methodology is their view of the believer's authority in Jesus Christ. And this is something that you will find, obviously, in New Apostolic Reformation, Word of Faith circles, charismatic circles, is this belief that Christ's authority translates into our authority, and that because we are seated and raised with him in the heavenly places, that his authority is ours, and we are to use it the same way that he used his authority. So Neil T. Anderson makes this point on a number of different occasions. Mark Bubeck, I could quote from all of these guys. I'm just going to pull out one quote from a man named J.A. McMillan in his book, The Authority of the Believer. There's a whole book about it, and here's what he says. Now, this captures the essence of the problem at the heart of this whole false spiritual warfare methodology. McMillan writes, quote, "It has been pointed out more than once in this study that the authority of which we are speaking is the portion of every believer. It's not a special gift imparted in answer to prayer, but the inherent right of the child of God because of his elevation with Christ to the right hand of the Father. He has become, through the rich mercy of God, an occupant of the throne of the Lord with all that it implies in privilege and responsibility. This elevation took place potentially at the resurrection of the Lord, and because of the believer's inclusion in him, it is ours simply to recognize the fact of this position and to take our place in humble acceptance, given all the glory and honor to God." Now, as one who just said that we are an occupant of the throne with all that it implies in privilege and responsibility, he mentions humility.
That is just a shocking statement.
Yeah.
That is an absolute shocking statement, that we occupy the throne of God, and we accept this with humility. If you think you're occupying the throne of God, you ain't humble.
No, that's right. And so this claim to authority is not something hidden in the modern spiritual warfare movement.
Right.
It is boldly taught. This is what they assume, that this authority is ours by virtue of the fact that we have been seated with Christ in the heavenly places. Right. So they take that positional idea of our being seated with him because we are united with Christ, and that's where Christ, our head, is. They take that idea of our positional unification with him, and they translate that into a prescription for what that means in terms of our living our Christian lives and exercising the authority that Christ exercised. And this lies at the heart of all that we have critiqued so far, the hedges, the hexes, the cursings.
Now that you've listened to the clip, I want you to consider that Jesus said to his disciples that they would rule the 12 tribes of Israel, Matthew 19:28. However, that will not happen at the resurrection, but will when the 1,000 reign of Christ happens. Jesus also spoke of those that are faithful with the few would be ruler over much, Matthew 25:21. Again, that is after the judgment of the believer and not before. Yet the believer has been given authority because Jesus said that he has all authority. And in that context is that of the church. Thus, we as the church are to go into the world. And he will back us up by his authority. Next, I want to look how Pastor Jim redefines what Jesus said. So listen carefully. Here is the scripture, John 14:12, and listen to it closely. Verily, verily, I say unto you, and I'm going to emphasize certain things as we go. He that believeth on me, the works that I do, he shall do also, and greater works than these shall he do, because I go unto my Father. Now, I overemphasize for a reason. Pastor Jim claims the greater works is the preaching of the gospel, and the results that more would come to repentance, since there would be more believers than Jesus as a single man. Yet when Jesus said the statement, the question I would ask, was he preaching the gospel only, or was he referring to signs and wonder? What were the works? If Jesus only meant the preaching of the gospel, then wouldn't he have said this? And I'm going to say as if he only meant the preaching of the gospel. Very verily I say unto you, he that believeth on me, the work, singular, meaning the preaching of the gospel, that I do, he shall do also. And a greater work, singular, than this. Not these, because the word this would be singular, while the word these is not singular. Shall he do, because I go unto my Father. Folks, this is the same thing Pastor Jim does with spiritual warfare. Pastor Jim should say the weapon of our warfare, and not the weapons of our warfare, though his book, somewhere he does mentions weapons. So I will not accept his sensationist premise inserted into the text. Yet the apostles did not do the miracles that Jesus did because Jesus' miracles were unique, according to Pastor Jim. To some extent, yes, but wait a minute. He mentions walking on water and the feeding of the multitude and rebuking of the weather. Though the apostles may have done some of those miracles, yet the apostles did do miracles that Jesus did not. And to me, that's where the greater works come in. Philip was translated to another town. Show me anywhere where Jesus was translated from one town to another. There is the possibility that he was in a boat one time and he came to shore quick. That's another topic altogether. Consider that the shadow of Peter, people lined up that were sick, that just the shadow passing by, people were healed. That's incredible. That didn't happen with Jesus. What about the Apostle Paul? He had handkerchiefs. They prayed over them. They were used to heal and to cast out devils. Can you imagine that? They pray over a cloth. They put a cloth on someone that's possessed and the devils come out. That's incredible. They spoke in tongues and also interpreted. There's no record of Jesus speaking in tongues. When Jesus mentioned that works that he did, he was not referring to the preaching only of the gospel, but to the signs and wonder that would go along with the gospel, like the raising of Lazarus from the dead, and that the apostles would do the same and even greater. See, the true colors of sensationism seems to be the focus a lot more than it needs to be, even though the topic is spiritual warfare. This talking about what can't be done anymore is not giving the topic proper justice. Imagine being a new Marine and being told everything you can't do that the previous Marines did instead of what you can do. Pastor Jim states, since the majority of references to demons are in the Gospels and not in the epistles, well, that's just proof that Jesus and his apostles were the ones to cast out devils only, because there should have been in the epistles, because that's written to the church. But I would remind Pastor Jim that the Gospels talk a lot about what was done as far as the historical aspect of it. And that's one of the main reasons why they were written. Whereas the epistles were to give out doctrine and focus less on the historical aspects. Why would one expect the recorded happenings in the epistles to be at the same level as the Gospels and the book of Acts if the purpose of the epistles was not to give out all kind of historical information, but to give out doctrine? Pastor Jim gives a rehash of stuff, no instructions on demons, and by the way, which he already talked about, and I've already refuted in show number 1. Justin then plays devil's advocate and says, well, Jesus is our example, and if he cast out devils, then we should too. Pastor Jim says he's an example of character, but not of the miraculous. Of course, the verse we just read in John chapter 14 says otherwise. But why stop there? Because Jesus is our example. Hebrews 12:2 says, looking unto Jesus, notice the author and finisher of our faith. It's not just one part, but the author and finisher of our faith. Hebrews 12:2 states that Jesus is the author and finisher of our faith, meaning in every way. This session is just a big emphasis on sensationism and not spiritual warfare. Think of it. What are you really learning from these sessions? Everything not to do. And just believe in the truth and preach the truth. That's all you're really learning in this whole program that they produce. Casting out devils, according to Pastor Jim, is a sign and wonder. And he claims if you could do that, well, you should be able to raise the dead and heal the sick. But Pastor Jim has confused the authority of the believer and the gifts of the Spirit. 1 Corinthians chapter 12 does not list casting out of devils because it's not a gift of the Spirit in the same way as other gifts are, though some may say it's under the topic of miracles. But by the authority that Jesus gave the church, one can. Some have the gift, they can even, of healing, and some can even raise the dead, and some do not. The Apostle Paul, after many days, notice, of a girl bothering them, did not preach to them, as Pastor Jim suggested, but cast the devil out in Acts chapter 16. Also, the Apostle Paul did not preach all the time at everyone, but cast out devils and wrought healings by clothes. Think about that. So if your only spiritual warfare weapon is preaching, then why was that done? And obviously the shadow of Peter healed some. So as far as reference to exorcisms, Acts chapter 5, 8, 16, and 19 are the chapters to look into. Pastor Jim mentions in the span of 30 years, there's only 4 exorcisms mentioned. Yet in the same span, I would ask, what about taking communion? How often was that mentioned? I mean, the term that is used is not communion, it's called breaking bread. So there's 7 times that bread is mentioned in the book of Acts. But is that how many times it refers to communion? No, it's not. Acts chapter 2, verse 42, Acts chapter 2, verse 46 is talking about communion. Then the next references are not talking about communion, but a holiday. Acts chapter 12, verse 3, and Acts chapter 20, verse 6. However, the third reference would be Acts chapter 20, verse 7 and 8. Actually, Acts chapter 20, verse 7 through 11. So that would be the fourth reference. But the final reference is having a meal with prisoners, not talking about communion. Acts chapter 27, verse 35. Well, let's do some math. So 4 times, Pastor Jim, in 30 years? What's up with that? If you're going to criticize that exorcisms are only mentioned 4 times, and because of that in the span of 30 years, then it can't be that important, then what do you say concerning communion? I know you're a pastor and you do communion. Now, of course, he criticizes those about cleaning out the hospitals, if this stuff is really real. Just bringing out doubt. We're supposed to have the shield of faith, not the shield of doubt, Pastor Jim. I mean, did Jesus and the apostles clear out all the hospitals? I don't recall saying that. He talks about, all these experiences going on today. The devil is probably faking a casting out of a devil. Is that possible? I assume that's possible, but to say that it's always that way, no, I do not accept that. But I could sum up this video, what Pastor Jim presented. Very clear. Are demons possess people around today? Yes. Can we cast them out? No. The solution is to preach the gospel, for that's the only weapon we got in spiritual warfare. Wow. Yeah. And of course, the Apostle Paul didn't do that in Acts chapter 16 or chapter 19. So is the only solution not to pray, but to give them a chick track? Really? It's such a poor and helpless response. And in the next section is what I call the big letdown. He has gone through 7 sessions and even going through the book. He's constantly tearing down the modern spiritual warfare, and some of it is wrong. I agree. We don't pray against principalities to take them down. That's not our realm. But at the same time, he builds up, and then when he talks about the armor of God, I'm like, seriously? this is what you believe, it's so pathetic. It's such a letdown. It's not even worth mentioning, except the fact that they recorded in John McCarthy's studio. And I will probably link a video when John McCarthy explains about the warfare, the spiritual warfare. And it's so much better and so much understandable than what Pastor Jim presents.